course, history is always being reinterpreted from a new perspective, but just adding to that story, fundamentally getting on the same page and having the same information, like is monumental.
Hello everyone, this is Miles Ezilo, back again for the Monumental Project on behalf of the Monuments Toolkit and US ICOMOS. Today we have yet another very special episode of the show. Here at US ICOMOS we are intentional about highlighting the current events and statues that are filling the cultural preservation discourse of today. It is our role to provide listeners with stories and narratives that show them what is really happening with monuments of oppression. This won't stop for as long as we're around. However, as you know, every other month in between our narrative episodes, we sit down with one organization in the cultural preservation space. We want to hear their stories, how they feel about the current situations at hand, and what they plan on doing in the future. It's these kinds of conversations that continue to uplift this field for the better. Up to this point, the Monuments Toolkit has sat down with leaders in the academic community, activism community, and even politics to gather different approaches to the conversation around monuments of oppression. This month we'll be speaking to an organization in the artistic community for a different point of view. To many, these monuments are nothing more than representations of dark times in our nation's history. But in the artistic space, these pieces are symbols that can be conduits for deeper conversations around the lost cause theory, reparations, and how we heal. One art center that is tackling this issue with fearlessness and grace is LAXART, a nonprofit visual art space that promotes development in contemporary culture through exhibitions, publications, and public programs. Their upcoming exhibition, titled Monuments, will feature decommissioned Confederate monuments displayed alongside existing and newly commissioned works of contemporary art. The Monumental Project had the pleasure of speaking with Hamza Walker and Hannah Bernstein, the creative director and program manager of this groundbreaking and timely exhibit. Hamza Walker is the director of the Los Angeles nonprofit art space LAXART, and an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Prior to joining LAXART in 2016, he was Director of Education and Associate Curator at the Renaissance Society, a non-collecting contemporary art museum in Chicago, for 22 years where he organized numerous shows and public programming and wrote extensively on the field of contemporary art. Hannah Bernstein is an arts researcher, educator, and public programmer based in Los Angeles. She is currently the project manager at LAXART. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hello, Hamza and Hannah. How are you doing today?
Pretty good.
Yeah, not bad. How about you?
Cannot complain. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with US ICOMOS and the Monuments Toolkit project. You guys' expertise and knowledge on the subject is well appreciated.
Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So let's hop into a bit of the questions just to start. If you could please give an introduction of yourselves and the work that you do.
Sure. My name's Hannah Bernstein. I'm the Monuments Project Manager.
Lovely.
Yeah. And I'm Hamza Walker, Director of LAXART.
Upbringing, this is for both of you guys. Did your upbringing or early career path influence where you are today at LAXART, or was this position something you didn't foresee that you kind of just happened upon?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in art. My background is more in historic art than contemporary art. LAXART is a contemporary exhibition space nonprofit. I think what I'm really fascinated about with art is this super interdisciplinary approach to looking at the world and the way that humans see themselves in it and kind of working through problems in these really abstract ways that I find really interesting. And so I think it's a natural progression of how I got here.
Right.
I use that expression, gatekeepers, which I don't like at all. In terms of how Hannah was describing things, I always think of it as like, in terms of a life in the arts. It's self-selecting, and so if there will be a gatekeeper only insofar as you think there's a gatekeeper. If you don't think there's a gatekeeper, then walk right on in. Which explains how I got here, actually. Art is an alternative space, and I actually cut my teeth professionally in an artist-run alternative space called Randolph Street Gallery in Chicago. It closed, I believe, in 1990. So I think its years of existence were 1977 to 1990. So in some sense, being here at LAXART is kind of a homecoming of sorts for me professionally. Returning to my roots in alternative spaces.
Right.
So as far as a trajectory, less a trajectory and more a circle.
Right.
Donut.
Yeah, the donut trajectory. We all know about that one.
Yeah, I'm on the donut trajectory. Exactly.
Right. Great. Well, thank you for that. So of course the topic of conversation today is the monuments exhibit, right? What is for both of you your earliest experience or memory dealing with Confederate monuments? Was it positive, was it negative? Where were you? How did that start to build in your own life?
Monuments in general or Confederate monuments in particular?
Confederate monuments in particular, yes.
I went to grade school in Baltimore, and so my first conscious memory of a Confederate monument was Robert E. Lee Park.
Right.
Actually, it's no longer Robert E. Lee Park. I can't remember what they changed the name.
Roland Park.
Did they? No, they didn't change Roland Park's the neighborhood.
Yeah, man. Now that it's called like Roland Park, Lake Roland Park.
Oh, Lake Roland Park is the name of the park?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right.
Wow.
Okay. Cool. And going to Robert E. Lee Park and being curious, knowing at 15, having had enough U.S. history to realize that they had lost the war.
Right.
So why is there something named after a Confederate? I mean, just a very simple question. Large as far as statuary goes, Baltimore is, martial law, basically. Yes, technically south of the Mason-Dixon line, but they were in the Union. That's how it got its name, Mobtown. It was when the Union soldiers came to Baltimore, mobs would show up at the rail station and hurl rocks at them. So Mobtown is one of the first names. So that's an interesting thing to learn as far as not necessarily a monument per se, but an anecdote about the Confederacy and Baltimore's relationship to the Civil War. But all of that said, Baltimore, as far as ye olde, Americana history roots in terms of, one of the original colonies. So there's all kinds of statuary. So that the Confederate monuments were just folded into monuments, statues of one sort or another. So they were just there, essentially. Generationally, I'm a post-civil rights child, born in 1966. So they didn't really purchase on not only my day-to-day experience, but as far as, tools of oppression, certainly. But as far as, a child of Black nationalism, learning how to negotiate my way around monuments was the least of my concerns as a child. So yeah, there was all kinds of other problems. I got 99 problems, and that Confederate monument sure as hell wasn't one when I was a kid. They are what they are, granted. But I would definitely say that perhaps, different generations have different relationships to those monuments. But being a child raised, in the immediate wake of the civil rights movement, as far as trying to instill in me a sense that the skies were the limit, possibilities are open to you. Those things did not figure into any kind of life trajectory. Right. So they have power over me. They're more like furniture. Like, your grandma's stuffy couch.
Totally.
Kind of thing. Just there.
Becomes part of the landscape.
You're part of the landscape.
Exactly.
Totally. I had a different relationship with monuments because I grew up in Los Angeles. And so, the way that I navigated the city was a lot of driving, less walking, some walking obviously still, but there were just fewer public monuments. And I now know that there had been my whole childhood a Confederate monument in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but that wasn't wasn't really part of my daily landscape. And I really only became sort of aware of the phenomenon of Confederate monuments when I moved to Baltimore, actually, in 2012. You know, and sort of my like ignorant white West Coast self learned about, you know, these things that were just littering the landscape all across America. And again, California has Confederate monuments of all sorts. We have, you know, Robert E. Lee schools, and the Alabama Hills are named after a Confederate warship. But I became aware of them when I moved to Baltimore also. I worked at the Walters Art Museum, and William Walters paid for not a Confederate monument, but Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision.
Yeah.
There was a statue of him right outside the museum in Mount Vernon Square Park. And I kind of became aware of it through that in a lot of ways. And like a lot of Americans, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the Charleston Church massacre sort of brought the topic into my like true awareness and made me more curious about it. And I started digging then.
But politically, you went to Berkeley.
I did go to Berkeley, yes.
Right. And so I would say the question, would be one less of like, it's like monuments say, and more kind of, I guess, political orientation, let's say, ideological orientation.
Sure.
Right. You know, as the more trenchant lens through which to,
well, yeah, absolutely. And learning about, thinking about physical objects having political power, like 100%. But I never, like, as far as the Confederacy goes, didn't think too much of it.
Yeah. I think that was probably I wouldn't say the goal, but that was like a secondhand effect of things like monuments coming up. It was almost just, it permeates the space without imposing too much on, your day to day. And it ends up being, a lot of those stories like, oh yeah, it was called the Robert E. Lee Park. I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School, or Stonewall Jackson, like street, like the things that happened, they just keep showing up in the past of, a lot of people's upbringing. And then it's become more prevalent nowadays. Anyone can answer. Please walk me through the ultimate decision and the ideation and the process of creating this exhibit.
This was Charlottesville, as far as Trump had been in office only 8 months, and so this I had just started here at LAXART, so kind of taking the socio-political temperature, let's say, as it relates to figuring out where we were headed programmatically. And lo and behold, find people on both sides.
Right.
So that was not simply pause for thought, but understanding that contemporary art aside, one of the most significant events culturally, probably within my lifetime, right, was the taking down of Confederate monuments. So to somehow want to engage with that,
right,
and recognizing that it's an historic occasion, right? When you begin to put it in the context of the civil rights movement, right, to talk about a trajectory of progress, let's say, right? No pain, no gain. So tension. So 2017, and then into 2018, as far as the idea for the show, to see if we could borrow, right, rather than have a show about monuments, let's go directly to the source, since these things have come down, to see if municipalities and institutions would be willing to loan, and then the idea of showing them alongside works of contemporary art.
Right.
Yeah, so 2018. So that's the and we began approaching municipalities, first visits, contact in early 2019.
Okay.
So this well in advance of the summer of 2020, actually, we were looking at around 40 monuments that were taken down between 2017 and 2019, right? 2020, right? And then after the murder of George Floyd, there was a cascade of monuments taken down. So another 150 monuments essentially come down. So it's upwards of 200 monuments came down from 2017 to the end of 2020, with the bulk of those coming down in late 2020.
Right.
So we'd already been kind of working it before then. So
I mean, and it's interesting too, because when I joined the project in 2019, initially the exhibition was supposed to open at, in fall 2021, and then the pandemic hit, and obviously the timeline was pushed back. But I don't think that without the pandemic and lockdown, we would have had, the protests of summer 2020 and had all these monuments come down. So fundamentally, the narrative of the exhibition changed, not just in the way that there were more physical objects available to us to borrow or to request to borrow, but the public discourse surrounding these objects and where they came from and what they meant had changed and kind of jumped forward. The dialogue had jumped forward. I remember in the first meeting that we had, I asked Hamza, because I initially started as a curatorial research assistant, so just really digging deep on these things. And I asked Hamza, how much are we going to get into the idea of reparations? And he was kind of like, oh, no, that's advanced. That's 201. We're starting with 101. Like, what are these things? What do they mean? Like real basic stuff. And then, after the summer of 2020 and the protests and largely not just about monuments, but about the American brand of racism and chattel slavery and the legacies of slavery, how that dialogue changes, then we can, the public discourse moves such that we can assume we're starting from a further place along and can get further down that pathway of what do we do? How do we move forward?
Right. And the dialogue shifted. Now that you mention it, and that's right, because it was going to be a focus. The scope was going to be really, really focused on them in an art historical sense. But the context changed because they were the objects of contention. And then after George Floyd, they became it was a mixture of shame and contention. Right. And that, I would say that is still the ratio of the ingredients in that cocktail, in that shame contention cocktail, is mercurial, right? And always change. So 2020 into 2020, shame. Now I would say, contention is, greater on the rise. Contention is on the rise. Shame is, shame is still there.
It's that pendulum swing, and it depends on who you're talking about and how communities respond to not just the monuments coming down, but the aftermath of that. And like it's not just monuments, but what are the, material gains that are being made by communities, communities across the country. And what else is changing besides the monument?
Right. I guess that leads well into the next question. The change is mainly based on context. Things changed around the monument conversation, and now the exhibit has shifted in different ways. So that's one pillar that US ICOMOS focused on heavily with our toolkit, which is recontextualization, right? What are ways that we can look at a monument, look at a statue in a different lens, and how does that shift the narrative? How does that change things? So in your opinion, both of y'all's opinion, how important is context when it comes to public art?
Well, context, I mean, it's not just a question of public art. Context is everything, arguably, right? I mean, nothing has value without context, especially when it comes to works of art. So there's a lot of talk about recontextualization when it comes to monuments, and there are a number of ways to recontextualize them, right? So the most the standard being, let's add more text, let's add a new plaque to it, right? We don't have to take it down or move it. So yes, that is one way to recontextualize it. Another is stewardship, right? So in a lot of instances, some of the monuments have gone to state historical museums, right? Which is just a shift and a change in context, right? So just to go from having this thing outdoors, in its original siting, transmitting its message, everybody accepting it for the Confederate monument that it is, as opposed to putting it in a state historical museum,
right,
that will then give it an entirely different frame, right? As opposed to if it's outdoors and you add another plaque, well, arguably, you're still dealing with this thing on its terms, right, as it exists, as opposed to you take it into an historical museum, it's like, right, the terms have changed, right? Now, let alone if it's under the auspices of an African-American museum, right, which is the case in Houston, which is the case in Richmond. Has anybody else taken possession? African-American museums that have taken possession of these, right? Where now that's a radically different context, right? In terms of recontextualizing. Now, with respect to the exhibition, having them indoors is very important for the exhibition. One thing, right? To not have them be outdoors. And two, to have them in a museum of contemporary art, right? So I think just the way that you will look at these things will be determined that the institution itself is the lens, right?
Interesting.
So you I think will be looking at them in ways that we don't look at these objects, right? They're just like, we take them simply as symbols, right? Point blank, right? We don't look at it's like, well, wait, as a visual artifact, what is this thing?
Right.
Let alone ones that are damaged, graffitied, right? Where you're no longer looking at this object as it relates to a past, right? Or an historical episode, and we're going to show a number of them that have been graffitied and damaged. On their sides, they can't stand up anymore because people try to pull them down,
right?
But those are, you're looking at something that speaks much more to the present and of the present than to the past or about the past.
Right.
So
interesting. Have any thoughts on this as well?
I mean, yeah, I kind of just echoing Hamza, like nothing happens in a vacuum, right? And so putting a plaque up to put context into a Confederate monument, even if it's still at the site of the courthouse, right? Where supposedly people are supposed to get a fair trial or conduct government business.
Right.
It's still, or historically, that was a spot in a lot of towns where Black men were lynched, in the exact same spot where the Confederate monuments were put up. Or in segregated parks where the Confederate monument was just another way of showing, no Blacks allowed, right? And so I think place place matters. And so there's a lot that, and context, there's layers upon layers upon layers of history, and these, the graffiti on them is just, another part of these objects' history and the places they've been. It's just as much a part of the object.
I was just laughing about, and it's great to bring up the points about those locations in front of courthouses, right? And parks, right, that were segregated, right? I mean, in today's parlance, right, in terms of contemporary art, that would be, I guess, site specificity. Right? Now these are like, right, so where it's like, oh, okay, where it's not the thing itself is not what's important, it's the thing and the site where it's located. So it isn't just a benign, outdoor thing, under those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, for example, in Lowndes County, Alabama, they removed their Confederate obelisk. That obelisk had been put up, I believe, 1 or 2 years after a man named Theo Holloway was lynched. And I actually think it's really beautiful. The Equal Justice Initiative has the Remembrance Project, where for their lynching memorial, you undergo, your community has to undergo a series of community engagement processes to remember those sites of racial terror. And now the Confederate monument is gone, but a marker for Theo Holloway still stands on the opposite side of the courthouse.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's beautiful.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah, so context really is everything. Very, very layered. Next set of questions are going to each of you individually. The first one is for Hannah. In your role as a project manager, what is the selection process for choosing certain Confederate monuments to display at LAXART, if there is a process at all? You know, without giving out too much secret sauce, are you looking for key characteristics in these pieces? What is the thought process behind choosing which monuments show themselves?
So I'll say first that as project manager, I'm not doing much of the selecting. That's really the curatorial vision. And so Hamza, Bennett, and Kara's job.
Okay.
But as the research assistant before the project started,
Right, exactly. I see what you're saying.
in that
Yeah.
role,
Hannah can actually, she actually has the high ground. There is a higher ground than curatorial, and the researcher is the higher ground.
Right.
yeah, so I, shout out to the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose heritage project they've done an incredible amount of research looking for all of the types of Confederate memorialization in the US, and that includes, yes, physical monuments of stone and bronze, but also street names, school names, holidays, parks. So really like the myriad of forms that a monument can take. And they mapped it and looked at the data of when they were built, who put them up, and put out these incredible reports. There are 3 versions, I believe. The first one came out in 2016, I think 2018, and then again 2022, if I'm remembering correctly. But they also made their data publicly available, which I think is so incredible as an advocacy organization to then make that data available. So for example, with us, I took all of that data and used it as a basis of what monuments had come down, and dug into each individual monument that was available to us to potentially loan, and looked at even deeper, who paid for it, what are the stories behind it, who is the artist or the company that produced them. Some of them are unique, distinct works of art that are made by, the way that we think of as, public sculptors, in a lot of cases, very prominent sculptors at the time.
Right.
And some of them are mass produced, and, there are companies in, Salem, Ohio, and Bridgeport, I think it's Bridgeport, Connecticut, that made these, mass produced sculptures that were both Union and Confederate statues. So a town would pay and have, you could order it from a catalog, and so the same figures will appear in both Union and Confederate monuments across the country. And so really looking into who are the people who made these, who are the people who paid for them, who are the people that are being enshrined in bronze and granite, and what, just really the deep dive on it. What is the history of the object since it was erected, and really compiling all of that. And it's about storytelling in a lot of ways.
Right. I mean, one of them, there's a story, like not just who is depicted,
Right.
but then, who paid for it, to look at all of those things in the round, and not just, any kind of aesthetic qualities of these objects. That was in fact probably the least of the things that we were looking for, as much as who is depicted, where the sites did factor in a number of occasions. But overall, I think it was like a list of 170, maybe 200, and then it got whittled down to like 65, 70.
Yeah, and it depended on, we started, like we said, in 2019, there were way fewer. And so we started making those requests, and, the pandemic put stuff on hold. And then obviously summer 2020 really blew it up again. And so, I put out Google alerts. So I used whose heritage project, the Southern Poverty Law Center, data in 2019, but then it was happening in real time. So I would
Right.
spend
Oh, right, right,
in the
right,
depths
right,
of
right.
the summer of 2020, when, 4 or
right.
5 monuments are coming down a day, I spent
Mm.
hours and hours and hours, my Google alerts, that was all I was doing, was just sifting through
Right.
news and figuring out, okay, and just trying to keep a running list of what had come down. I couldn't even get into the research portion of it until much later because I
Exactly.
just had to keep up with
Yeah.
the sheer volume.
And the cast of characters. I mean, we were pretty much by and large in most of those cases looking at utterly generic
Mm.
monuments. But what was interesting in the newsfeed was the cast of characters surrounding, people arguing to take it down, people arguing to keep it up, and the kinds of local political shenanigans
Right.
that were at play. And so Hannah's newsfeed, it doubled. It was called Confederates in the News. Every Friday, she would just kick it out. And it basically doubled almost as news of the weird. I mean, in terms of, you couldn't make this stuff up.
Right.
In terms of the cast of characters, city councilman takes chainsaw to Confederate, and how like 82-year-old city councilman takes a chainsaw.
That's
Wow.
Johnny Ford in
Johnny Ford, yeah,
Tuskegee, Alabama.
right, right.
Wow.
I mean, he's how old? He's
in his 80s, yeah.
Yeah, he's in his 80s. Yeah.
Picking up a chainsaw. That is
Yeah.
crazy. Sometimes when it comes to getting the other side of the story, or sometimes trying to, I wouldn't say change the mind of some people who are more rooted in tradition or heritage. You know what I'm talking about. People who wanted to keep the Confederate monuments up. Having the energy instead of the focus could be a bit challenging because you're not too sure what they will come away from if you give them everything and not necessarily a direct message. To my question would be, with how does LAXR go about reframing the narrative around these statues to hopefully change public opinion, if that's the goal at all?
Mm-hmm. Exhibitions are museums as spaces for reflection.
Right.
And so I don't know, essentially the notion of public opinion and how public opinion is swayed, the role of headlines and media. But exhibitions, I would say, operating perhaps at a different speed and a different kind of intensity, right? To great question is worth a hell of a lot more than some answers, right? And so the goal of exhibitions is to try and raise questions, right? And I don't know if the idea of changing public opinion, of course, I mean, there's the field of play and it's a site of contention. But right now, I think I'm more focused on discussion and being able to, given the contention surrounding these things, can we create a space for dialogue and discussion where, regardless of where you fall on the issue, right? First, you'd have to acknowledge that these things have come down, right? So it's not like we're taking them down for the exhibition. Now, this is after the fact, right? So that's already happened. But regardless of how you feel about it, right, one way or the other, to this be a place to reflect and to learn in the hopes of having more civil discussion.
Right.
And especially when it comes to American history, right? It is wild, it is woolly, and its cast of characters you couldn't make up, right? So for all the discussion now about what is taught in schools and the teaching of American history, and trying to come to some kind of to narrow the scope, let's say, right? As opposed to the more you know, the more there is to appreciate, right? And to understand. And so to broaden it, to open it up, as opposed to try and shut it down, right? So I think of this show as far as a move towards reflecting what if you remembered all the stuff you learned in high school, right? You'd be smart as hell, right? Like,
Right.
right? Especially in U.S. history. And you go back, you're like, yeah, the Missouri Compromise. Yeah. You're like, yeah, the nullification craze. Yeah. You know, so to go back to these episodes and chapters and these characters in American history, some of whom you may have gotten in high school, some of whom you won't know, but to re-engage with that for the sake of having a much more civil and robust dialogue around who we are as a country, what our values are. So that's the role of the exhibition.
Right.
On that topic of American history, I'll just add like the public opinion thing. Like, we learn history in fundamentally different ways all across the country, in different geographic places, in different generations. So like even the fact of getting on the same page of what actually happened, and of course history is always being reinterpreted from a new perspective, but just adding to that story, fundamentally getting on the same page and having the same information, like is monumental in and of itself.
Exactly.
Because if you're telling someone who has believed their whole life that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and slavery, the myth of the lost cause is really attractive for a very particular reason. If slavery is not that bad, that's life shattering. Your conception of America is fundamentally different.
That's
if
like
you,
saying there's no Santa.
Exactly. And so I think it
yeah.
can be really comfortable to stick with the lost cause and not have to question your place in history and where you come from and where we've been together as a nation. And it's about national identity, right? Like America is neither good nor bad. I mean, or it is.
Yeah, well,
we all have our opinion.
Right. I mean,
and we all have our opinion of what that is. But I think that's where like there are these core beliefs that are really just preventing us from
having a discussion.
And so it's like about these, can we get on just even the same page even if we don't agree on the interpretation, can we just agree that all of these things happened?
Yeah, right. In an era of, I guess, where the truth is, alternative facts. But the lost cause, if we were to distill the exhibition down to a single point around which I would say not necessarily there's changing minds, public opinion, I don't know, but just learning, right? So to learn what the lost cause is and to kind of tear it out, root and branch. Right. So if the exhibition has a single pedagogical goal, it would be to take on the lost cause.
I guess, a bit of a lighter topic. What are you most excited about upon the release of the exhibit? Whether it be the community response, the collaboration that can come out of it, political response. What are you most excited for once this kicks off?
I think we have the same answer.
Oh, really?
Artist commissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's artists. Yeah,
I want to see how these artists that are being commissioned take on these topics and turn them into something like physical and real. And I think that's the power of artists, right? Is that you can take down the lost cause point by point in an academic essay, and that is so valuable as a tool, right? And in fact, it's been done over and over and over again, and yet here the lost cause still is living on strong today. And I think what artists can do is really hit an emotional core that can change hearts and minds, as they say, and just the beauty and the terror and all of it together.
Right. I mean, that is one of the many things that I would be excited about, right? Which is when you get involved with artist commissions, I mean, to watch something come into being, right? And one thing, I mean, there are different kinds of exhibitions. So when you work with an artist to do, a career survey, a retrospective, right? It's another thing to work with an artist on producing a new work, right? Those are a set of conditions under which you get to know the artist, right? You get to hear their ideas, professionally, you become something of a sounding board
Right.
for ideas, which is the most privileged perspective one can have on the creative process, I would say. So there's that. That's one. I would say in terms of if I were to characterize the exhibition, it would be as a 5-ring circus, right? Each one of the rings is kind of exciting, but the exhibition will also allow for other kinds of projects. It becomes an occasion, let's say. So one of the things we'll be showing Andre Serrano's Plan series from 1990.
Okay.
They were amazing photographs. I mean, relative to the kind of controversy that's surrounding the Philip Guston exhibition, in terms of representations of the Klan. Philip Guston's working the ropes of caricature, right? As opposed to Serrano, right, where he photographed in 1990 the upper echelon of the Ku Klux Klan. Wow. Incredible portraits of them. I saw the show in 92, put me on my ass. So as an occasion to bring that work back into view, right? And I can't think of another set of circumstances that would allow an institution to show those photographs now. Right. There's the immediate outcry, right? If they were just shown unto themselves. Right. So I appreciate the fact that this exhibition will allow a look back, right? About where art has been on a lot of these topics, right? The tough stuff.
Right.
So yes, to certain passages in the show that I have in my mind in terms of the dialogue between contemporary works and the monuments. It keeps me up at night in the best possible way.
Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. Man, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing it. I got to make a trip out there to pay my respects. I really can't wait. Well, we're coming up on the last question. I just wanted to thank you guys again for being a part of the Monumental Project and all the work that US ICOMOS is doing. It truly means a lot. The final question, which is kind of the question that we center our entire project around, it's a bit heavy. Answer it as light or as heavy as you see fit. How do we correctly address monuments of oppression?
So many. I
think it's not a one size fit all, I think.
I mean, by monuments, I mean, I in some sense, that to me, I would get rid of the monuments in that question. Just like, how do we correctly address oppression? It's like, and in fact, the monuments are in the way. And that would be what I like about us getting down to what this is really about.
Right.
In terms of, power, authority, right? Having voice and agency, and those things being denied to particular groups, right? For one reason or another, right? We talk about, violence, right? I mean, do you mean an act of violence, or do you mean a system of violence, right? So then, it's like the act is easy to identify, right? But a system much more difficult to engage with, right?
Right.
So in that respect, that would be my answer to that. It's like, let's get rid of the monuments, right? So let's take them down so that we can get on to the discussion about naked oppression, not symbols of.
Just oppression in itself.
Yeah.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to US ICOMOS and being a part of our toolkit. It really makes a difference getting people from all sides of the conversation, people in the art field, people in the activism field, scholars, people in the political sense. I feel like when we talk to as many people as possible on this subject, we can get the most holistic answer towards, like you were saying, not necessarily a focused answer, but more the best way to open up the discourse and the conversations for other, situations and problems moving forward. So thank you guys for being a part of it. It's been great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode. We'd like to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the entire US ICOMOS team, and all of our listeners around the world for tuning in. If you'd like to share your thoughts on today's subject matter, feel free to email us at monumental@usicomos.org. We would love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to tune in next month as we look at the depiction of indigenous peoples in public monuments and the stories that come with it. As always, I'm Miles Ezilo. We'll talk soon.